I'm sure they don't know the guy that told you it was bad. So
I should have every crazy or bad people encounter, but that not represents all of us.
Sorry, I apologize to all of you.
Our point is not
没有民主的话，我们为什么可以来到这里呢？
Do you think you really covered the whole thing about what happened in Hong Kong?
You said we are brainwashed, but
Let me explain. Like every city have to pay tax to the government in China, but like Shanghai that's a company. Shanghai every year pay the Chinese government like billion tax to the government. But Hong Kong, none. They don't pay tax. That's like China is always supporting the development of Hong Kong. I don't know why they address us like so badly.
I think the issue about Hong Kong, if I'm not mistaken, is not that much economic. In the sense that Hong Kong has its own huge economic problems, like inequality and people and the price of housing, that's for sure. But the reason why people are pissed in Hong Kong is not directly because of the economy. It plays into the economy, and of course, like inequality doesn't help. But the reason why, I mean, you know the story better than I do, but the extradition bill started this whole thing, but now it went beyond that. It's more about what they feel as a lack of control over their own elective processes. Right? I think that's what they feel. It may be right, it may be wrong, I don't know.
Do you mean like Hong Kong does not
I'm not saying that they do, I'm not saying that they don't, I'm saying that from what I understood from what my friends have told me, that's the way most of those people in the streets feel. And the feeling is important, right? Whether China is totally being a dickhead with Hong Kong, or whether they're totally in the right to do it, I don't know. I've not read enough, I don't know enough about it. But the way Hong Kong people feel, from what my friends told me, is that they feel that control is being stripped away from them, right? And that they're not being respected in their autonomy. Because up until 2047, they still have it, right? And they should have it legally, right? So I'm not saying that China is the bad guy. It isn't. It's not the bad guy, and I'm not saying that Hong Kong people are the bad guys. But there are some processes politically that have led to a situation where basically people don't feel heard. Right?
So as someone who's got some friends from Hong Kong as well, having spoken to them, the general feeling is that because Hong Kong was effectively British for so long, that political culture has really seeped into Hong Kong's political culture in a way that just isn't seen in mainland China. So what we have is a political culture that is far more aware of the importance of liberty and individualism, and this conflicts fundamentally with China because China's system is incompatible. Essentially what's happening in Hong Kong is the manifestation of the Western British liberal political system and political philosophy clashing with the fundamentally collectivist Chinese philosophy. And so what we see is a system like China's, where the individual is far less important than the state, clashing with a system like Hong Kong's, which has adopted the Western idea of thinking of the individual as more important than the state and the fundamental building block. So what we see in these current conflicts is essentially that China is trying to push its state first, this is a simplification, China is trying to push its state first mentality, whereas Hong Kong, knowing what this will cost them as individuals, does not want this. Because they've seen what's happened in the past where China got its own way as a state at the expense of individual Chinese people, often in the tens of millions. And naturally, they don't want this because, well, they don't want to die in an accidentally state-engineered famine or be sent to re-education camps. Who would?
I'm afraid that's very clearly a huge oversimplification.
Yeah,
of
but
the way
apparently
it works
that's the
in
way
China
like
and
two
in Hong
system
Kong
exists.
and in
You
political
were saying
thought
yourself
in
it doesn't matter. You were saying yourself it doesn't matter. It's the
What
way
does
people
it
feel. It's the way people feel. I'm not talking about.
Well, then you
I'm not
have to
talking about whether
understand
China
why
is
people feel
actually
like
harvesting
that.
people's organs. They are. But the important thing is what the Hong Kong people think China's going to do, and which, with the police brutality, with the detention centres, with all the tragedies that happened in the 20th century, one can't possibly blame the people of Hong Kong for thinking, you know what, we don't really want to be a part of this system. And so the fact that China is so quickly trying to renege on the one country, two systems policy, is it called? After less than 25 years of this supposed 50-year handover situation, I can't blame Hong Kong in the slightest for saying, no, screw this.
Yeah, I think basically for the last 15 years, as the relative economic importance of Hong Kong has decreased proportional to China, the CCP has seen it basically an opportunity to start chipping away at the one country, two systems political division before the 2047 deadline. So every time that there's been major protests up until this moment, it hasn't been economic, it's been because of political reforms that, from my perception, Hong Kongers have seen as either violating those treaty-bound political liberties that they're supposed to have, or just generally incrementing on their philosophy, like you were saying. Like the extradition bill, it was all started because they were afraid that then that opens for a venue for the Chinese mainland government to extradite political opponents.
And China are not exactly discreet about the fact that's exactly what they want. They want to be able to extradite.
And if that happens, then you're undermining free speech, which is protected under one country, two systems.
Yeah.
It's a perfectly reasonable response, I think.
Yeah.
Even if you
So is your
think...
man there a commie apologist?
I don't know.
But, yeah. So, are you guys from Hong Kong?
I'm mainland.
Mainland, okay. Fairly rare for someone to be sort of agreeing about the problems in Hong Kong, from what I've experienced of mainland Chinese at least. So what sort of version of events, well I suppose the real question is, how does the version of events you've seen sort of being around the UK differ from what the Chinese state media has portrayed the situation in Hong Kong?
You know, China, we sort of, we are so proud of Hong Kong.
To be honest, I don't
like,
care.
We think that part of China is like developed so quickly, and we are so proud of it. But then and then we come here suddenly, like everyone, Hong Kong said we are not Chinese.
The face they have an
Like every.
So do mainland Chinese not know that Hong Kong don't think of themselves as
Like, so
Chinese?
the conversation goes like, where are you from? I'm Hong Kong. Okay, so you're Chinese, you speak Mandarin. No, we're not Chinese, we don't speak that. So the conversation goes
I
like,
think some opinion polls show that for the first time now, there's more people that identify as Hong Konger than Chinese in Hong Kong now.
Yes, I remember
So
when
that is a trend.
yeah.
When there were-
I guess some people in Hong Kong has been, like, you know, brainwashed. I guess so. Maybe
Well, but
our
do you
people
understand
in
how it's a
mainland has been
reasonable
brainwashed, but
response if you're seeing you've never been under Chinese sovereignty, so to say, and you've always had autonomy, and now you see China as infringing upon your political rights, which you see as given, that's something you should have. Do you see how it's a natural response to say, I don't want to be associated with that?
Because
I
remember
want
how
to be
much...
associated with Hong Kong and its
Yeah.
separate history and its separate political freedom.
So remember how much the Chinese government can do to you as mainland Chinese citizens compared to what they can do to the citizens of Hong Kong. And then,
There's a very different perception of China depending on the history that you have with it.
yeah.
I mean,
Because naturally, controlling all of the the textbooks, all the way history is taught, all the media, the Chinese government has for generations had basically absolute power over what Chinese citizens are taught,
yeah, but
and that's what they think.
absolutely. I mean, as far as I know, the textbooks from Taiwan and Hong Kong are totally different from us
Yeah,
and
they are.
taught in
But there have been
mainland.
attempts
So
to change those textbooks.
people say like we control their, I don't know, autonomy or something like that, but we have nothing to do with it. We give like enough autonomy to themselves, and they sort of develop to like less quickly than, I mean, like Shanghai and Guangzhou, and they said
Yeah, but
we
they
don't
were.
want.
Hong Kong developed very quickly in the 20th century, though.
Yeah, but not
Hong Kong is the product of free enterprise.
yeah, but not now. I mean, like,
Well,
it's
no,
not the
because
first.
it's already a developed economy. It's like a Western economy. They don't
in
develop
Hong
as
Kong
fast.
nowadays is for the younger generation. The problem is their generations because their education is totally different from us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they're the drivers of the movement. But that's
The
reasonable.
older generation have also a different generation from mainland China. So I think the identity thing is gonna vary over time. And when, for instance, when it's 2008, the Hong Kong people acknowledging themselves as a Chinese is historical high, and it kind of dropped because they feel that after 2012 the political control has been tightening from the mainland China. So I think it's very relevant to the current political system. And if the system could not fix or elevate their feeling, I think it's really hard for Hong Kong to cool down and back to stability. That's what I think is about the root cause is about the system. The people could not voice out their opinion. They want to express it in elections, but certainly we can't. So we could only express our opinion outside the institution. That's why I think the movement has been expanded.
I mean, China has been developed so quickly, and then maybe when the country becomes so powerful and strong, and then it sort of want to control everything, and maybe the Hong Kong feel they are being threatened because China has been so powerful, and maybe they are not ranked first in the economy, and they sort of start to blame the system. I mean, the system could be some errors in it or some some holes in it, because it has been system for 20 years ago. So absolutely there's errors, but you can't just blame Chinese people for not caring about them. I mean,
I think the sentiment I've seen is that people in Hong Kong at least don't tend to blame the Chinese people. They recognise it's the Chinese government that claims legitimacy by claiming to be the voice of the Chinese people. But it's a one-party system with elections every 20 years. It's not as if the actual Chinese people have a great deal of say in what the government does, realistically. And that's one of the problems that people in Hong Kong have, because I suppose essentially, as China's attempt to take over Hong Kong it's failed, essentially. It's doomed, because as we use I don't know if you come across this phrase in the West, the cat's out of the bag, as we say.
the cat's out of the bag.
The cat is out of the bag, so that means that essentially the secret's out. So for China to be able to effectively take over Hong Kong, for what China wants. So what China wants to do is effectively take over Hong Kong and make it an ordinary Chinese state. The problem is, of course, that the people of Hong Kong have access to too much information about what that's meant. So you know how information about detention centres, Tiananmen Square, all that sort of stuff is suppressed in mainland China. The problem is that information wasn't suppressed in Hong Kong, because now everyone knows about it. Which means, of course, that people in Hong Kong are never going to accept Chinese rule, because they know it could mean that they get massacred or arrested summarily for saying the wrong thing on the internet or what have you. And naturally, that is not an appealing concept, because everyone wants to look after themselves. They don't want to live under a system where they could be arrested and disappeared for saying or thinking the wrong thing. And the thing is, that knowledge is not going to go away. People know it now. The whole of Hong Kong knows what the Chinese government is like, what they want to do. And so China has essentially no option but to pull out and wait for generations for attitudes towards them to soften. Otherwise, they're going to end up with basically a war on their hands. So, I mean, someone suggested, this was a joke, but I think there's actual merit to it, you could make Hong Kong completely unconquerable to the Chinese by just shipping a whole load of unregistered firearms in there. They're like how they have in America. Basically, everyone has guns, so it can't be conquered, because if you try to get an army in there, even an army as large as China's, every other person on the street can shoot them. And that's going to destroy the morale of the soldiers long before it destroys the morale of the people who are resisting. And that's the situation in Hong Kong right now. If it's that close to them being completely unconquerable, China has failed. China has failed in its efforts to take over Hong Kong, and that's not going to change within potentially our lifetimes. Essentially, if China wants to maintain its relations with the rest of the world, it needs to basically give up on Hong Kong, because the only way the Hong Kong situation is going to end in any way in China's favour is with bloodshed, which would turn the rest of the international community against them.
Sorry, but what's your meaning of giving up?
Essentially, the people of Hong Kong know what being ruled by China would mean, which means summary arrests, restrictions on their liberties, all detention centres, all the stuff about Tiananmen Square, which of course the people of Hong Kong know about. And thus that...
Do you mean like British gave up Ireland, and is that same for we to give up Hong Kong?
It's kind of similar, yes. So basically, for Britain to control Ireland would have required them to continue bloodshed and shooting people essentially who resisted, because the people of Ireland knew how much it sucked being under British rule. Likewise, the people of Hong Kong know how much it would suck being under Chinese rule, so they're going to resist it until their dying breath, because they reckon that if they lose this fight against the Chinese government, they're basically dead anyway for resisting in the first place. So they might as well just keep resisting. Hence the idea of China taking over Hong Kong.
So, in your point of view, there should be a separate state, like what happened with the Confederacy of America.
At the very least, China should maintain the one country, two systems policy, and make it obvious they're maintaining this for generations.
Sure, but the policy was like in its
it was
detail.
Supposed, supposed to integrate.
Last to 2047.
Yeah.
But
so
what
happens
next? What happens next? According to the deal, is Hong Kong become part of it?
The problem is China's pushed too hard, too fast. So they've essentially tried too hard to integrate Hong Kong without having taken into account that the people of Hong Kong know what China's done in the past, the Chinese government. So they're not just going to roll over and let it happen. It doesn't matter to the people of Hong Kong what the deal said. They didn't write that deal. It was made up between Thatcher and whoever was in charge of the Chinese government in Hong Kong 20 years ago. It doesn't matter to them, because a deal from a generation ago, they're not going to let govern whether they're allowed to say what they want.
But the difference between Ireland and in the case of Ireland, Hong Kong cannot supply itself individually.
The way things are now, not really, but Hong Kong has enough. Well, exactly. Hong Kong is
7 million people. It has a high GDP.
Yeah, but when you consider the geological conditions like water, electricity, resources, spaces.
That's true for many countries.
So
not all countries are entirely self-sufficient.
For those countries,
not being part of China.
Japan is actually bigger than United Kingdom.
I know.
Oh yeah,
but
Japan's
what
well
you're
over 100
saying
million
that the
people.
country isn't self-sufficient in terms of natural resources, that's fine, but that's not an argument against sovereignty.
Because it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be independent in terms of resources.
Singapore was actually kicked out by Malaysia.
Well, yes, but it is an independent country, but it doesn't have the resources to be.
So the important thing is, can they support themselves financially?
Ethnic group in Singapore is different than that of
of course it's
Malaysia.
different, but I'm just saying
are
that
you saying that
just because you
Hong
don't have
Kong
the
are
natural...
different than Chinese?
So
Hong Kongese are different.
It has a different
people.
history.
The point
it
I'm
has a
making here
different
is that
political identity,
it doesn't matter that Hong Kong can't feed itself with its own resources, because it has enough wealth that it can import it. And the thing is, a lot of the Chinese economy around Hong Kong is very much integrated with Hong Kong's economy. So if China were to try and essentially besiege Hong Kong, well then, first of all, that would turn the international community against them, because they would be besieging Hong Kong. And also, it would badly affect the Chinese economy because of how much that is linked to Hong Kong's economy.
Yes, word besieging. Seem you are arguing that Hong Kong government is pro this.
Well, Hong Kong government is pro-China. It's part of the problem.
Yeah. So they are
because the people of Hong Kong aren't.
So
well, the thing is, they would be besieging the people of Hong Kong. Because this is the distinction. The people of Hong Kong are resisting, but the government of Hong Kong are, well, they've been especially put in place as Chinese puppets. They're far more amenable to China as a system, as a state, than the people of Hong Kong, because the people running Hong Kong, they're safe, they're in the upper echelons of society, and chances are whatever bad things could happen to the people of Hong Kong, which have in the past happened to the people of China, they won't affect the people at the top of the society. They're protected. So the people running Hong Kong have very little to worry about, whereas the citizens of Hong Kong, the ordinary people, they're the ones who are in danger.
Do you mean like their way of life is under danger?
It's not just that, their way of life, but also what that means. Because I was saying to the group earlier, Hong Kong values individual liberty, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, far more than mainland China does. And that's because Hong Kong essentially has the sort of the English tradition of liberty, whereas China has the Chinese tradition of collectivism and sort of state focus. So what bothers the people of Hong Kong is that now that they're used to these liberties, they're used to being able to say what they want and sort of think and do what they want. They're really not keen on the idea of that being taken away from them, the way the Chinese government would take away from them.
Well, what you just said is very realistic, and I believe in you. But when you compare this case to a familiar case, it's